Now that you've completed your first knowledge check, we'll look at these fieldwork requirements in more detail. This can be confusing, so feel free to come back and reference these guidelines and to ask questions if you're unclear. This table on page 5 is going to be another area where you're going to come back to this often. Some people like to take a screenshot and just print this piece out, glue it on the front of your binder, stick it on your laptop, but this is something that you're going to want to know from front to back. The main difference between supervised and concentrated fieldwork are outlined in this table. First, you'll see that in order to qualify for the BCBA exam, a supervised fieldwork student must accrue 2,000 total hours throughout their experience. For concentrated supervised fieldwork, the number is smaller. 1,500 hours are required in this case. Both supervised and concentrated supervised fieldwork have a supervisory period of 1 month. That means that each of these specific criteria must be met in that calendar month in order to count all hours worked or all qualified hours worked towards that month. In order for a month to qualify, you must do at least 20 hours and at most 130 hours of behavior analytic work approved by your supervisor. For supervised fieldwork, 4 contacts with your supervisor are needed, whereas concentrated supervised fieldwork requires 6 contacts per month. You'll have at least one of those contacts with your group supervisor through Lindenwood faculty, but you may need to arrange additional contacts in order to meet these requirements. Office hours and other meetings can be used for these purposes. For both supervised and concentrated fieldwork, 1 direct observation with a client is necessary. This should primarily be arranged with your on-site supervisor. However, in rare cases, there may be options for your group supervisor to arrange a typical kind of observation. The biggest difference, in my opinion, between these 2 options is the percent of hours which are supervised. The supervision percentage is calculated by dividing the supervised hours by the total fieldwork hours. For supervised fieldwork, you only need to have 5% of your hours supervised to count. However, at that concentrated supervised fieldwork level, 10% need to be supervised in order to count your full accrual. This means that someone wanting to accrue 130 hours in a month of concentrated supervised fieldwork would need to have 13 supervised hours. We talked briefly about the difference between individual and group supervision, but here is another reminder that our group supervision cannot exceed individual supervision in one supervisory period. The other big difference that can be difficult to start navigating at first is restricted versus unrestricted activities. For now, keep in mind that at least 60% of supervised fieldwork must be spent engaged in unrestricted activities. Restricted activities are typically more similar to things done as an RBT, whereas unrestricted activities are things like behavior analytic research and moving yourself up into a more supervisory role where you can act as an independent BCBA. This is also a good option for including in your supervision contract because your on-site supervisor may not be able to bill for all the time that you are engaged in unrestricted activities. The onset of fieldwork begins when trainees have started qualifying coursework. This means that you can begin accruing hours after attending the first class meeting and having a secured qualified supervisor. You must have your supervisor approved through the Folio Tech process before starting to accrue fieldwork or concentrated fieldwork hours. When you're looking at planning your supervision experience, you also want to keep in mind that the time frame of fieldwork cannot exceed 5 continuous years. That means for those of you starting fieldwork in spring 2020, you must be completed with your fieldwork by spring 2025. If you need additional courses other than those given by Lindenwood 1 through 4, a fieldwork continuation course might be necessary until you meet these requirements and have accrued all of your hours and are prepared to graduate. If students want to accrue hours in fieldwork and concentrated fieldwork, they can do that, but they have to know that concentrated fieldwork is weighted at approximately 1 1/3 times the temporal value of supervised fieldwork. So you'll need to come up with kind of a little Excel document that weights your hours so that you know that you've met somewhere between that 1,500 and 2,000 hour accrual, and that in each of those experiences, the percentage of required supervision, direct observations, and number of contacts must be independently met for each supervision type. All right. We talked about having a minimum of 20 and not more than 130 hours of fieldwork each month. There are two different kinds of these fieldwork hours. Fieldwork hours include independent hours, which means your supervisor may not be present or may not be providing supervision to you during the accrual of those hours. Supervised hours generally only include time when you and your supervisor are both present. If for some reason you are unable to meet one of the requirements outlined in the Fieldwork Requirements table, there is an option for prorating the month. There's no specific formula for prorating, but typically the process involves meeting with your on-site and faculty supervisor, explaining the deficit, and determining what a criteria would be for counting a portion of the hours accrued. You'll want to keep clear documentation of that meeting and the process that you decide on between those three individuals, because in the case of an audit, you'll need to demonstrate that you did this with your supervisors. Clients can include anyone for whom behavior analytics services are appropriate. You cannot use someone that is related to you, and you can't use your primary caregiver or be related to the primary caregiver of the client. These client requirements include having multiple clients throughout the fieldwork experience. All this means is that you can't work with only one client for the entire 1,500 or 2,000 hours. You'll need to have some variety. This is the requirement for the duration of fieldwork, not just each supervisory month. So if there is a month in which you only work with one client, don't worry, this does not qualify you as needing to prorate that month, but you'll want to make sure you get additional experiences before your hours are completed. Acceptable activities are those that you can count towards your accrual of experience. The primary focus should be acquiring and demonstrating the skills on the 5th edition task list, and also the professional or soft skills needed to interact effectively with consumers, supervisors, and families. Your supervisor is the person who is responsible for determining whether activities qualify for accruing fieldwork, and they need to also be consistent with the requirements in this document. Acceptable activities include conducting assessments, designing, implementing, and systematically monitoring skill acquisition and behavior reduction programs, writing behavior treatment plans, progress summaries, clinical notes, and professional correspondence, overseeing implementation of behavior analytic programs by others, training, designing behavioral systems and performance management, communicating and collaborating effectively with caregivers and other professionals, and other activities normally performed by a behavior analyst that are directly related to behavior analysis. This is kind of the catch-all that you'll want to be very careful with, and make sure that you've discussed with your individual and faculty supervisor to make sure that you're still accruing acceptable activities when you log your hours. Remember that designation between restricted and unrestricted activities? This is the portion of the document where you'll see these things spelled out in a more specific way. Restricted activities include the time spent delivering therapeutic and instructional procedures during fieldwork. While this is certainly behavior analytic in nature, only 40% or less of your time can count as restricted activities. This is because you are doing more than being an RBT. You're learning not just to implement procedures that someone else has written, but to become a behavior analyst and see these things in a dynamic and pragmatic way. Unrestricted activities are those that are most likely to be performed by a BCBA in typical practice. You must have at least 60% of your hours for total field work, not each month, but total field work, at least 60% of your hours must be unrestricted. It's very common for people to begin by accruing more restricted hours in their early fieldwork experiences and end with most of their time being mostly unrestricted. This is because your skills are getting better, you're building rapport on site, and getting more and more responsibility as you work towards becoming a BCBA. Some activities that are unrestricted include observation and data collection, training staff and caregivers, conducting assessments related to the need for intervention, meeting with clients about programming and services, conducting functional analyses and preference assessments, data graphing and analysis, researching literature relevant to a current client's programming, and writing and revising behavior analytic programs. Note that researching the literature can be something that you can do on your own time and definitely should be counted towards your accrual of hours. A lot of people end up shorting themselves because they aren't sure how quickly they should be reading or whether the articles they're reading are relevant. So make sure you work closely with your supervisor and get credit for the time that you're doing this that directly relates to how you practice on site. Unacceptable activities are also important to note. If you are going to incur an audit and had unacceptable activities logged in your fieldwork documentation, you may not be able to count those and you may no longer be eligible for the exam until you make up those hours. Unacceptable activities might be necessary in order to maintain a paid compensated position on site, but should not be logged as part of your 20 to 130 hours or part of your fieldwork documentation. Some examples that would not count as fieldwork include attending meetings with no behavior analytic content, providing interventions that are not based in behavior analysis, performing administrative activities, trainings related to service delivery, such as crisis management, CPR, billing, positive behavior supports, things that are required by the state, completing non-behavioral assessments, so diagnostic or intellectual assessments, attending professional conferences, workshops, and university courses, and didactic course assignments. So if you are doing something that is behavior analytic, but you're doing it only for your course or for your grade or for your assignment points, this would not be something you can use as a fieldwork activity, even if you get some help on site or get some help from a faculty supervisor. Didactic course assignments should not be logged on your fieldwork documentation. Let's stop here and do one more knowledge check. The next module we'll cover is how to document the supervision and the fieldwork experience.